Welcome everybody to the Internet Association of Australia online event, From Encryption to Takedowns. We should have a really interesting evening tonight. Hopefully we've got all of our attendees admitted by now. If not, they should be joining us very shortly. So perhaps I'll just chat and wave my arms around for a minute or two just to, set the scene or get us all going. We've got all of our attendees admitted. We are expecting to have 4 panellists tonight, although unfortunately just at the moment we've only got 3. So hopefully our 4th one will be showing soon, and I expect he will. He's usually very, very reliable. We're also lucky enough tonight to be able to broadcast live not only to Facebook but to YouTube and across the Internet Society live channels, thanks to my dear friend over in New York City at the moment. So we've probably broken our record for the number of time zones present for a session. And what a session to have it on, from encryption to takedowns. We've got a whole bunch of things coming through in the internet regulation space at the moment. And we at the Internet Association of Australia have been really busy putting together a range of submissions just to our own regulators here within Australia. We've been working on things like, the National Broadband Network competition stuff. We've been working on the usual privacy reviews. And we've also got a new thing come through called the Online Safety Act, which is a mechanism by which the e-Safety Commissioner is intending to use to force content providers and internet service providers to take down material. They already have this power at the moment, but that power at the moment only applies to children and women, and now it will apply, if it is passed the Senate and enacted, then it will apply to all users of the internet within Australia. So that's another piece of regulation that we've been looking at. There's also the reviews that have happened of the telecommunications and other legislation, and we noticed too that things around the world have been heating up, and other jurisdictions have been enacting similar sorts of legislation and regulation. And quite frequently, these come about for very, very good reasons. So let me then introduce, before we get on, I need to do some of the housekeeping stuff, of course. So a couple of housekeeping things are, you're all at home or in somewhere familiar, so I don't need to point out the emergency exits, but please use them if you do need to. We will be sending out a feedback survey tonight so that we can at least get some feedback from you on what sorts of topics we should have in the future, whether you can even do some. Are there improvements? Are there ways we could do better or do worse? Any future topics that you might want, or even our members, if you have networks that you want to tell us about, or technologies you want to tell us about, or even issues that you want to tell us about, we're really keen to hear from you. Even member demos we'd be keen to see. And of course, even peering socials. At the end of the evening, we will do a Lucky Door Prize. And the Lucky Door Prize, if I can even just manage to show it to you, is our fantastic new mouse mat, which is, of course, if I put it too close to me, I disappear. We've printed off this fantastic, great big new mouse mat of our actual network. So I'll show you a better picture of it in a little while if I can. But we will be drawing that at the end of the session. Okay, of course, the fine print here, our board did adopt a code of conduct for our events. At the end of this event, we normally elevate everybody to panelists where we all get the opportunity to chat and so forth. But in summary, our code of conduct is be respectful to each other, be accepting and support everybody to participate. We want to hear people's views. And if you can't be nice, then we will kick you out. You'll appeal, but you can appeal, but we won't be able to deal with that at this time. Okay, on to the hot topic. Of course, first of all, I want to mention who we've got on board here. First of all, I've got Jordan Carter. He's the Chief Executive Officer over in New Zealand for InternetNZ. They run the .nz namespace. And Jordan has made a massive contribution over the years to not only namespace policy issues, but a range of other policy issues. And of course, their big issue of the last few years has been mooting the Christchurch call, which has come about in response to the appalling things that happened in Christchurch 3 years ago now. Jordan's responsible for their overall leadership. He's the spokesperson for Internet issues and executing the strategy for InternetNZ. He cares deeply about the difference the internet can make good in people's lives, and gets out of bed every morning because of the difference InternetNZ makes, and I believe that. So Konstantinos. Konstantinos is Senior Director with Policy Development and Strategy with ISOC, the Internet Society, the Global Internet Society. Konstantinos provides analysis and strategic advice in support of the Internet Society's policy, advocacy and mission, including the promotion of the open development, evolution and use of the Internet for the benefit of all people around the world. Konstantinos has extensive experience in Internet policy and governance arrangements, and he has been a tremendous help to me in the work I've had to do over the years, advocating for names and numbers and so forth in various places. We've also got Lucie Krahulcova, who's the Executive Director from Digital Rights Watch. Oh, and I should mention, Jordan's over in Auckland right now, if I have that correct. Konstantinos is in Geneva. Lucie is in Melbourne. Lucie is a professional activist and digital rights advocate specialising in surveillance, law enforcement powers in the digital era, export controls, encryption, data retention and telecoms regulation. Lucie's background also is quite international. She previously worked in Ottawa and Brussels and spent 5 years at the digital rights NGO Access Now. So she brings quite an international perspective as well. Of course, in Melbourne, being one of our very international cities, they're not allowed very far at the moment, but hopefully tomorrow you'll be out, Lucie. And I've also got Patrick Fair. Patrick is the principal at Patrick Fair and Associates, a most learned man, as we can all tell. I'm confident he's read every book behind him there. Patrick's an experienced commercial lawyer with expertise in telecommunications regulation, intellectual property, information systems, radio communications, data governance and commercial contracting. He's also industry professor at Deakin University School of Computing and chair of the Communications Security Reference Panel at Communications Alliance. And Patrick and I have had many debates over the years about how regulation should work in the Australian telco sector. And Patrick, I believe you're in Sydney. So hopefully you'll be able to put forward a lot of the Australian point of view. Now,
correct.
We do have to move to some questions. Yeah, I've introduced everybody. Tick, done that. So I think we'll start with a short round robin. You can just give me your, what do you think are the hot items, folks? So what are the hot items on your regulation radar for 2021? What do you think are your, say, top 3, 5 issues right now? I'll go to Jordan first, because I know, Jordan, you've got to head out early this evening. Jordan.
I do. Thank you, Narelle. Kia ora, everyone. Ko Jordan Carter Tokuinga. Nice to join you from Kiwiland. Look, I'm going to try and do this in 2 minutes, which of course isn't going to work, but I'll do my best.
Great.
I don't know whether in Australia you see yourselves as a small country in a big internet world, or a medium-sized country or a big one. We see ourselves as a small one. And a classic example of small country diplomacy, I think, is the Christchurch call, which I'll just talk about a little bit. Because when that attack on the Muslim communities in Christchurch happened, it could have been quite easy for the government here to leap into regulatory mode and pass laws and threaten fines and all the kind of sort of chest-beating response that politicians like to do. And instead, the New Zealand government took a bit more of a considered thing that was partly realpolitik, saying, well, we can pass whatever laws we like, but the big companies can ignore us. And also because there was enough of an inkling that actually working together with companies to effect change might be a better idea. And so that was the key essence behind what happened with the Christchurch call, a call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. That is a big call, because elimination of anything on the internet is very, very challenging. And the role that we've tried to play there is to make sure that the civil society voices are listened to, not just a company government bilateral process in this, and to try and support the advisory network to have a real voice in the work that's being done. And some of the topics in the call are useful. The work on algorithms is really important, because I think a whole bunch of the propagation of this content and the precursor content that radicalizes people and takes them off in this direction is an algorithmic question with the big platforms. And so that is a big focus for us in New Zealand. We've got some of the traditional focuses. We have a broadband network too. Our fiber to the premises network in New Zealand is up to about 86% of households. And that's having a regulatory readjustment going on. We're about to launch a review of media law. There's a bunch of issues around sort of AI, facial recognition, oversight of the police and so on. So, it's an interesting and small country regulatory dynamic over here. that overall picture is saying that the internet is a global resource and we need to try and manage its impacts globally, while recognizing that the way we do that in the global internet world isn't actually dealing with the problems that we face as communities, is, I think, a key challenge for us all to grapple with. So hopefully that's of interest to the people listening. Thanks for having me.
Wow, that's a fascinating concept, is work together with the tech companies to eliminate the abhorrent material. What a novel thing. And it doesn't surprise me that New Zealand should be the place where this concept of cooperation and respect should come together. And this principle of working on algorithms too, and the precursor material. Hopefully we'll unpack that a little bit more if we've got time with you before you head off. I thought should then jump from New Zealand over to Geneva then and ask Konstantinos, what do you think are what are your top 3 to 5 issues, do you think, at the moment, Konstantinos?
Yes, and thank you very much, Narelle, and hello, everyone. Good morning from Geneva. So, I have the tendency, because I'm in Geneva in Switzerland, of taking a step back and looking at the regulatory picture as it unfolds all around the world. And I would say that there is some consistency in the way we see some governments approaching some of the issues. So if I were to give my top 5, I would say content moderation, of course, is at the top of everybody's agenda currently, and everyone is really talking about it, and they're trying mainly through algorithms, and that's where Jordan's comment also comes in handy, coming to play. Encryption is the other one where we actually see this being played out, often in conjunction with content moderation. Data localization as a topic is also increasing around the world, and right now it is going beyond the usual suspects. The European Union is actually talking a lot about data localization laws. We have competition law, and especially in this part of the world, in Europe, it is one of the major topics. And especially the question that regulators are trying to answer is the issue of interoperability, especially in the context of APIs. And last but not least, it is copyright, that I don't think has ever left us over the past decade. But if you take all that, one of the interesting things that is happening, and I think that this is the change, if you want, over the past couple of years, is the way these regulations are being considered, and most of them are being premised under this idea of digital sovereignty, which provides a totally different spin in some ways, because Jordan is very right? We are trying to regulate nationally into a global communications network, and we have the responsibility of maintaining this global reach that the internet is having. But by the time you spin it off with digital sovereignty, it completely gives it a very different note, and it creates dangers for fragmentation and all the other issues that perhaps we could unpack.
Yes, the concept of fragmentation of the internet is often one that emerges when we start talking about digital sovereignty and data localization issues. They certainly are those ones that come forward when we always look to the internet previously, or perhaps even still a bit today, that it is this international platform for cooperation, a global platform cooperation and interaction. So then let's go over to Lucie. Lucie, I know you've been attending RightsCon this week, so hopefully you'll be super up to date on the sorts of issues that have been going around. Lucie, what are your top 3 to 5 topics then?
Thanks for adding 3 to 5. I definitely probably have an extremely exhaustive list. RightsCon, for those who don't know, is a fantastic opportunity to get up to speed on the global human rights tech intersection. And I'm disappointed that it's happening online again, but I'm delighted that I get to partake because it's got kind of a 24-hour format now. So I don't know what day it is. I don't know what hour it is, but I'm excited. Look, today there was a screening of a film called 1,000 Cuts, and it sort of documents the situation of press freedom and the cyber libel law in the Philippines. And then there was a session with Maria Ressa after, who's been an incredible advocate for freedom of speech there. And I think an internationally renowned personality at this point. But it was incredibly eye-opening to me to see the film and then hear her speak, because there's a lot of, I think, parallels that could be drawn about the sort of language that government has used increasingly, and the sort of hostile environment they've gradually built through a series of legislations. And as I was watching it and then digesting the panel, I was just thinking of the Australian slow mission creep that started with TOLA, that we're now seeing, obviously with this week's news is being heavily pushed into increasing surveillance and additional laws for national security. So I saw a lot of parallels in the sort of infamous Duterte comparison of when he said that it's not about human rights. To him, it's about human lives. That to me becomes an incredibly stark sign of what's to come for the internet space and freedom of press space. So, and I think that's what we're seeing a little bit from the government here, that prioritization. So for me, as always, the sort of eye is on national security legislation and surveillance. I've been involved with TOLA ever since the first drafts were dropped. At the time, I was still in Brussels, blissfully. And the flights, I remember I was asked to appear, and the flights were like 35 hours round trip to Canberra. So at the time, it was via video, and I've since been able to be here and consult on essentially every part of the consultation that's been run since. And of course, I've been participating on the consultations now for the Identify and Disrupt Bill and the International Productions Order, which has been spruiked and has been back in the press this week. So for me, those are really top priorities, because I think, we're seeing a real push from the government to move away from judicial oversight for a lot of these measures. And I know it's sort of a meta topic for a lot of people to think about, but I think there's really important shifts that have huge repercussions for our judicial system and the way we do things. I'm sure Patrick will have a more eloquent way to surmise what that means. But that's my priority. And I would also say the government here in Australia is undergoing Privacy Act review. That's a top priority for Digital Rights Watch. And globally, I think since the GDPR, we're seeing more conversations about that in different jurisdictions. So I like seeing that. I participated in the Pakistan consultation on data protection a year ago, and I'm very excited that we're going through the motions of that in Australia. And otherwise, I think I would echo what's already been said. I've been tangentially involved with the Christchurch call. I think Jordan and the team there with InternetNZ have done a fantastic job at really bringing a community and stakeholders together. We saw the sort of reactionary policy situation happen in Europe many times. France, when I was in Brussels, when we had the Brussels attacks, and there was really, I think, a tendency to shut down the government and kind of close off the conversations, pass really incredibly pervasive and long-lasting national security or state of emergency laws. And it was really, to me, it was almost hopeful to see New Zealand kind of pull in the international community and try and make it into a conversation. So I think that can't be, the effort that took, I think can't be understated. And I was really grateful to be a very tiny participant in that process. And of course, facial recognition and law enforcement use of AI is always super high on my list. So I'm very closely watching what's happening. We just had an announcement in New South Wales that Microsoft will be providing AI. They didn't call it facial recognition, but it's implied. So I think that's going to be something we keep pressing. And we've joined this week at RightsCon, we've joined over 170 organizations globally calling for a ban on biometric surveillance specifically. But there's a lot of different niche areas there, from emotional surveillance that Spotify's trying to flirt with and other pieces. So I'm really concerned about that. I guess mostly because I still feel, to go back to my point about national security, we really haven't drawn the red lines around where government and law enforcement ends when we have technology really permeate every part of our lives around us. So I'll end there. I feel like I said long enough.
No, that's a great list, Lucie. Really, you've touched on a whole bunch of really big topics that I'm sure we can get onto even more. So I must go over to Patrick then. So Patrick, what are your top 3 to 5 topics then?
Hi, Narelle, and thanks for inviting me along. It's great to be participating in such an interesting and learned panel. I thought what I might do is just sort of be a bit more specific about exactly the onslaught that Australia is facing, and then make some comments about sort of themes. So there's sort of A, B, and C category national security and law enforcement reforms in Australia under consideration in the pipeline in various ways. In category A, I'd put the new online safety legislation, which is a new scheme to expand the powers of the Online Safety Commissioner. And, there's a 24-hour takedown, there's power to go at search engines, there's power to go at digital products and apps. There's new regulation of content, there's new blocking powers, there's a whole sort of suite to upgrade what the Safety Commissioner can do. Also in category A, I'd put the Identify and Disrupt Bill, as mentioned by Lucie. This bill's interesting because it's a lot like the Toller Act, but instead of having consultation and sort of moderation in it, the best we could manage to get into the Toller Act, which wasn't great. It's got nothing. It's like a 19th century warrants bill, where the police can just rock up and say, I'm taking over that account, or I want to know all about the communications in that account because it's associated with what I think is a criminal enterprise. And the takeover account power isn't even in the Surveillance Devices Act and going to a senior judicial officer, it's going to a magistrate. And all 3 of those new warrants, the account takeover, the disruption warrant, and what's the other one called, the network activity warrant, they are each accompanied by a new compulsion power, so that if you happen to know how to assist law enforcement to get into an account or to execute the warrant or to overcome encryption, then the order can be directed at you to help them and to make it happen. So that's already in our Surveillance Devices Act as part, it was put in as 64A as part of the Toller Act, but we're getting 3 new ones, one for each of those specifically. So that's those would be my category A. My category B's are, there's the new critical infrastructure framework. So it doesn't really directly go at the internet, but there was a consultation paper released about a month ago where they discussed the definition of critical data processing and storage asset and the definition of critical telecommunications asset. And the critical telecommunications asset is basically, you are a telecommunications asset.
Yeah.
And the definition of the critical data processing storage asset is very aggressive, is around the wrong way. It's if predominantly you serve somebody who is a critical asset, then you have to comply with these new laws. The big impact for the internet on this is just that it's a big regulatory payload, but also there's a rapid cyber incidents response obligation. And if you happen to qualify as an asset of national significance because of the interdependencies to what you provide to others, which could be many internet services and systems, then the government's put a whole new suite of powers in where they can install stuff, monitor your behaviour, make you participate in an emergency exercise. So I put that in B category because it's not so directly impacting. Also in the B category, I'd put the reviews which are underway but haven't been progressed. So, for example, the Independent National Legislation Monitor's review of the encryption bill got buried because basically he agreed with what the civil society and the industry were saying. You can't exercise these powers without judicial oversight. They're too important. And the government's just ignored that and is hoping it will go away. There's also the report on the Cloud Act, which we're waiting for, and the review of mandatory data retention, which had some refinements, but looks like we're going to, that'll be maintained, and the 2-year period will be maintained. Security sector reforms for the telco sector is also there, and that's sort of indirectly, that's B. And then in C category, I'd put some of the things which are sort of early days. So there was a review of the Privacy Act last year, which was, and one of the issues that they were focusing on was, is somebody identified by a cookie, for example, or a digital identifier? Does that make them sufficiently identified to be the subject of a personal information, by regulation? Now, if you'd asked me, I would have said yes already. Not a problem. You look at the reform, look at the discussion paper from the Law Reform Commission in 2008, where they said that's what we're trying to do. But for some reason, the ACCC and the regulators don't really think that somebody's telling them that if you're identified by a digital marker, you're not actually identified. And so there's going to be some work on that. And there's other things in there that could be relevant. There'll be mandatory consumer protection rights being proposed, and there's other changes potentially relevant. Another one that's also in the early days is there was a report called the Richardson Review that was published late last year, which recommends that all our national security legislation, the Surveillance Devices Act, the Toller Act, the Interception and Access Act, all be swept up in some new massive electronic surveillance law. And the government has approved that recommendation, but as far as I can tell, there's no sort of nobody's digging. There's no early foundations being dug for that. But who knows what's going on, behind the scenes. For example, identify and disrupt just got dropped on us from on high, without any notice. So I don't know what's really going on. So those would be my 3 categories of things that are really relevant. In terms of, I just wanted to sort of touch on some themes from those, which I think really focus should focus our minds. The first one that really concerns me is the lack of consultation in identify and disrupt, right? You can't sort of dump a warrant on somebody saying, I'm taking over the account from a major service provider without sort of talking to them about what the warrant should say and how the information should be protected and how it should be managed. And it's the same with particularly disrupt, which involves removing data and crushing data, and the network activity warrant, which involves a major sort of intrusion on privacy. The second theme that's really important is this government power to the government's current practice of putting into new legislation powers to just install software that they want without telling anybody. It was in Toller, right? And we looked at it in Toller, and we said in a number of submissions, look, you can't do that. You can't just install that. We don't know what it's doing. We don't know how it affects our systems. We haven't tested it. And also, there's a major gap in the way our regulatory framework works, because the way they've crafted in the Toller Act anyway, your obligation to get a warrant to intercept a communication, it requires you to say, I need to get that warrant, that communication from you. So I've got a warrant. Here it is. Give me the communication. But if you can install software which opens up your system and delivers the content without anything, where's the existing framework relevant? And so they've put that into in the encryption bill. It's in the national security legislation. And when you look at what the powers are for identify and disrupt, the power that can be ordered is to interfere with, intercept or obstruct, and there's additional discretionary powers which are just not moderated by any sort of civil considerations or framework. So that's 2. My third one, final one, sorry for going on a bit, is just the surveillance, the surveillance question, right? So are we being surveilled as a population in order to find people who are up to the wrong thing? And one of the things I've sort of flagged in that area is when you look at the mandatory data retention regime, there is nothing to stop a national security or law enforcement agency from just saying, I consider it relevant to the protection and safety of Australians or a particular project to take all the metadata from everybody in Melbourne, run it through an analytics engine and see who's behaving like a drug dealer.
Yeah.
Now, you might think that's a good idea and could be very effective finding drug dealers. It might save us a lot of money, a lot of taxes. But if the government's actually moving to a point where it's surveilling people at large and looking for exceptions, whether or not they've committed an offence or come to the attention of the police, then that's a serious issue for public policy, which we really ought to be thinking about. And I think we need to be watching that closely with the legislation before us, and also when pressing for reform on the TOLA legislation.
Yeah, we do indeed, don't we, Patrick? But I think that the stats came out this week that the industry was just not listened to when the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Act went through. Because I think, if I remember correctly, you and I were at the same industry function in December of that year when it went through. And I seem to remember at least half a dozen of us there, all on our phones directly to the various politicians in Parliament House at that very moment who were about to go and vote on the legislation. And we were all literally begging them to rethink it, to literally begging them at the time to just have a little bit of a look at what we'd suggested to them might be some good ideas. Now, I know Lucie's bursting to respond to some of the comments that you've made there, Patrick. They really are, those themes there, the lack of consultation, particularly even in the execution of warrants and things. That's a really interesting one. And this government practice to install software, exactly. When my team do an upgrade on our network, we do regression testing. We try it before we stick it in the network, before we go live. And if some dude in a trench coat's going to turn up with a USB stick and say, hey, do this, I've got the authority, I really want to think twice about it. Sorry, Lucie, you did want to make some comments, please.
No, I love hearing how you want people to think about laws before they write them. That would be great. Can we live in that world? No, as Patrick was going through, I just kept nodding. I was like, yes, I should have gone into more depth about this. I think the review that James Renwick did in particular for TOLA was a really long process. I can't state how many times. I think in total I wrote 8 submissions between the parliamentary inquiry itself and the consultation that we engaged with. At the time I was still at Access Now for a big part of it. That's how we engaged with that consultation. To see it be buried has been heartbreaking. But also a lot of that, I think the reason a lot of that is being buried is because he suggested that the powers be extended to the federal level ICAC as well. And I think that was kind of his overarching way of saying, would you really be okay with this if you knew that somebody could just tap into and listen to private conversations? The Richardson review, which I have read and I found very funny because at the beginning of it, it's like 1,000-page document. Richardson it's daunting. It says we don't expect anyone to read the review in its entirety. Well, allow me to say, there are those of us who are very invested in this cause. But yeah, that's one issue that I definitely didn't mention, and that's the electronic surveillance overhaul. And I'm extremely concerned because, as Patrick pointed out, TOLA already went way further than any other law that I have worked on internationally. And I think the UK Investigatory Powers Act really pushed us at a time, and then came TOLA, and we thought, oh, okay, it can get much more intrusive. And some of the issues that I raised in, for people who are watching, some of the issues that I raised in those hearings is like, you're completely separating the system from individuals and their rights or any sort of liberties and freedoms. When a warrant is issued, the law enforcement officials go directly to the company. And then the company can argue on behalf of the user if they think that their rights are being violated in that jurisdiction. And at no point and of course they have somewhat of a business incentive to do that. I think we've seen internationally, I think actually this is the one thing that the big tech has really done is push back against these requests, because obviously once they start rolling over, they're going to lose trust and they're going to lose a lot of their user base. But they have fought back to this. And but I said, why wouldn't you add like a third person, someone to actually represent the individual? If the thing is so covert and the individual themselves can't know, like ex ante, they are, it relies on the covertness of the operation. Appoint a lawyer who can actually be there on principle and defend the individual's interests. And moreover, once an operation is complete, you have a responsibility to notify people who haven't been brought up on criminal charges that they have been under surveillance. I think for me as a human rights person, but as someone who comes from Eastern Europe where secret trials happen, it's just, this is the most logical thing, is to actually, if you are pretending that you have a democratic country and you're pretending that there's democratic governance going on, you have a responsibility to let people know. And they have a right to say, whoa, I shouldn't, if they want to bring it to the court and say I shouldn't have been in the scope, they should be able to. And I remember, James kind of looked at me. He's like, what if it's like 70 people? You want them to let 70 people know that they're being surveilled? And I was like, yeah, those people were under surveillance for 3 years. Their entire families potentially were impacted. God knows their businesses and whatnot have been impacted. There's a liberties argument here that I think they should know. But also, as Patrick pointed out, there's a technical compromise that could have happened to these devices. And people have a right to know and understand to what extent their mobile, their computer, whatever system they're running, if it's even a server at home or something, they have a right to understand how that's been impacted and a right to question whether that was the case. And in Identify and Disrupt Bill, I'm even more concerned because the network activity warrants that they want to issue are so broadly drafted that if there's a warrant served for me and I'm using WhatsApp, ultimately just about any user of WhatsApp, the entire WhatsApp network would fall under the scope the way it's drafted. That's insane. And to then say we're going to charge, and I think we need to start looking at the numbers. Even for Ironside, we had, I think, 12,000 devices or something like that, and we have 800 people brought on charges. It really brings up the question of, is the internet then just a sifting ground to see who's a criminal? And are we going to just see these huge warrants that scope millions of people, drum up 5, 10, 20, few hundred criminals? And are we good with that as a society for everyone else to not know that they went through that process, that someone looked through their communication and said, not illegal enough, we're good?
Okay, so you mentioned Europe there, so I need to throw to Konstantinos here because he is right across all of what's going on in the European legislation, I'm sure. Konstantinos.
Yeah, so hearing both Patrick and Lucie talking, one of the things that kept coming back to me was this word, this term of transparency, this idea of transparency. And what we're seeing happening, especially in the context of internet regulation, is that transparency has acquired a very different meaning, a very opaque meaning, and it's quite questionable right now. Traditionally, when you go through a regulatory process, there are a very standard transparency process that the government or the regulator needs to follow. And here, in the context of the internet, for some reason, we're seeing them swept under the rug. There is one particular thing that Patrick mentioned, and I hadn't also realized that this is happening in Australia, that is a global phenomenon, if it makes you guys over there feel any better, is this whole idea of taking content within 24 hours. And no one is really going back to dig deeper into what this means exactly. And this means that, big tech is actually saying, okay, if you want us to do this, because of the amount of content that is getting uploaded on our platforms, we are going to use algorithms, otherwise known as upload filters. Yeah. And there are a lot of things that people say about upload filters, and all of them are true, by the way. And human rights activists are, they're questioning the fact that they're overblocking, and they raise significant concerns over free speech issues. But for us, from an internet society point of view, one of the things that we started noticing about those things is what they actually also do to the technology, right? And what they do to the internet themselves. So upload filters are essentially being embedded into the networks of those big.
Whoops. I just see a little glitch there. Konstantinos, come back, come back.
It's an upload filter.
Companies, they become part of the infrastructure. Can you hear me?
You'll have to recap that last sentence,
Can you hear me?
Konstantinos. I think there might have been a glitch somewhere across the Atlantic or the.
Well, I was able to hear you, so I'm sorry. So what I was saying is that we are seeing that upload filters are also, apart from the human rights and free speech issues that they raise, also do considerable harm to the architecture of the internet, because essentially what they're doing is that, you know, they're getting embedded into the infrastructure. They become infrastructure themselves, and it's very questionable how interoperable they are as a building block within the internet ecosystem. And worst of it all is that these are being sold by tech companies as the solution to dealing with objectionable content. And they are, you know, and instead of actually trying to address, and in many ways, one of the things that we are trying to do through regulation is tame this dominance of big platforms. They're actually cementing their dominance, because they're the ones that can actually create them. And those filters are very expensive. We already know that YouTube's Content ID upload filter, which is for, you know, to capture copyright infringement, cost them $100 million to develop. So imagine if you are a startup or if you are a small business and you have a certain amount of funding to operate, you are never, ever going to spend that kind of money to develop an upload filter. So essentially, you're going to go to one of the big tech companies and license it. So we're also seeing that innovation is getting affected. And all that is happening through extremely opaque processes. We don't know how those filters are created. We know something about, we have heard that there are databases of hashes being created, but we don't know exactly what they are. We don't know which terms they're making into these databases and how they applied. Yet again, throughout the world, Australia, as Patrick said, the European Union just passed an anti-terrorism regulation where it literally mandates upload filters. The copyright directive also in the European Union mandates upload filters. In Canada, there is currently a lot of discussion about this very thing, mandating upload filters. France, at a national level, France and Germany are both mandating upload filters. And the interesting thing that is happening there is that they're not actually saying you need to use upload filters, but they're saying you need to take content you need to take content down within 24 hours. And big companies are saying the only way we can do that is through upload filters. So transparency literally is out of the window, and it goes, you know, and it starts from the impact starts literally from issues of speech, and it goes all the way down to the architecture. And, you know, if there is one thing that my colleagues who are engineers have told me, and I keep on repeating it because I hope that at some point it will register people, actually policymakers, is that the internet, if the internet is going to die, it's not going to die from one cut. It's going to die from 1,000 cuts.
Okay, you've just paused again, Konstantinos, so I think I'll take that opportunity
and I have
to
the fear
that. So this concept, I hadn't realised that there was this sort of de facto mandation of upload filters going on. I mean, surely with an appropriate process around takedown, there should be some sort of opportunity for redress or rectification. You know, if your content gets taken down because it was thought to be bad, but it turned out not to be bad. I used to do breastfeeding support back when my children were quite little, and I would support other mothers and support them online to assist them in breastfeeding their babies. And we would have a lot of pictures of breasts, let me tell you. And more than once did we fall foul of this concept of, you know, that's an actual naked breast there. well, yeah, but not for long because there was a baby. So where would be our redress in this sort of approach that, hang on, that was a very important piece of educational information that is required literally to feed the babies. So how do we, if we're just getting them mandated to include upload filters and so forth in order to facilitate rapid takedown, how do we facilitate rapid putback to ensure that we can rapidly do the good that we do with education and programs within our society? I don't know, Patrick, have you heard of any of that within the legislative processes that you've been thankfully going through in detail?
There has been an appeal process in some of the takedown framework. Actually, I can't say that I've really looked at the Online Safety Act in terms of that, but I seem to recall when it was first released that there is a process where the content owner is notified and can object, and the content may be put up. I mean, it has been, I think, a real issue. I mean, in Australia, the big one last year was the abhorrent violent material framework, which was written post Christchurch, but in such a way that a provider merely had to be it was a low standard of proof as to whether they'd shown reasonable care regarding what was on their systems, and that sort of caused some alarm in industry because you don't know what's on your systems. Part of what you sell people is that they decide what to put on your systems, and you just deliver it, to the net. So, how do you exercise care when you're providing that as a service? And no matter what we said, I think it was a meeting with the Prime Minister where he reportedly said, "I hear what you say, but I don't care." So,
well, we are certainly arguing that case at the moment with the Online Safety Act that those baseline hosting operators and baseline internet service providers, internet access providers, who are my bread and butter, my members, we're certainly arguing the case for them that they play no part in the mediation of content. All we do is take the packets and pass them through, or provide that baseline computing platform over which others have the control of applications and services.
But if I may, sorry, Patrick.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add to what you were saying, that that this idea of filtering can go deeper, and it can actually require service providers to know what they've got and have some and positively review what they're taking when they're not even the final step in the chain, publishing the content. I think that's going a bit far.
And if I just may add, Narelle, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, because again, intermediary liability is one of those areas where every single part of the world is being rethinking what it means. We are actually seeing in some jurisdictions, some intention to go deep into the infrastructure and ask some infrastructure providers to actually do this content moderation that is going to be, as we all know, extremely problematic because this is not their job, right? And one of the things that we keep on saying to policymakers that are attempting to do this is that you need to understand that if you ask infrastructure providers to do this, you will be taking off resources that are necessary, that they spend, for network upgrades, network security, and all the rest, and ask them to do something that they were never meant to do. They don't care what sort of data goes through the networks intentionally, because the system is designed in a way that they don't care. So you really need to focus on content moderation on those platforms that actually support user-generated content. And to its credit, and I will finish with that, currently in the European Union, the Digital Services Act is actually trying to do this. If we look around the world, the Digital Services Act is perhaps the most focused and informed regulation that we're seeing in that respect, because it did make the split, right? The categorization between infrastructure providers, therefore you have no liability because you're just providing the services. And then we have new players that have emerged since 2000, and those players need to focus on content moderation.
Yeah, we're doing that. That's similarly in the Online Services Act that we have here. I think Lucie's also going to chime in on this topic or a related one. Yes.
Well, you guys have kind of ran away from the e-safety and then circle back. So we're okay. Yeah, I wanted to add, in terms of the resolution issue, that's one of the, like, challenging the decisions. That's one of the big objections that we submitted to the Parliament as they consider it, because and I think that's a concern, especially among sex workers and the adult industry, but many others too, is there's really no intuitive or easy process for people to challenge when content gets taken down, because it's the legislation only foresees a case where there's like an abuser or some sort of cyberbullying or something very clear cut where the content can get taken down and that person has no say. So there is a sort of burdensome process foreseen through the AAT, yeah.
Yeah, the Administrative Affairs Tribunal. I want to mention them again too, because they're the ones under the, is it the Slade Act, which are also being given additional powers or likely to be given additional powers. And the Administrative Affairs Tribunal they're not judicial at all. They are, and I do not want to make any slur against any of these good, fine people, but how many of them actually have degrees in law or experience in regulation? They're a range of people from a range of backgrounds, and many of them seem to have close relationships with a lot of politicians, rather than, dare I say, an open process where the best people might be selected.
Sorry, but it's a good point you raised. But they were also considered in TOLA as the place to go for the resolution of some of these issues. And it really just again brings it back to we're really reshaping like the judicial system and the way people can actually enforce their rights if we're delegating it basically into what is glorified dispute resolution.
Yeah, but we're getting lower and lower standards for authorization. And yet even that doesn't seem to matter, because if you look at the report that came out from the on the Australian Federal Police, or was it, no, the Canberra, and no, they only have the Australian Federal Police in Canberra, don't they? Where there was recent numbers published about their access to location-based data or data retention metadata. Help me out here, Patrick. Are you aware of those numbers? I think it was 3,000 of them had been conducted, and only something less than 10% had actually had the appropriate levels of authorization.
I'm not familiar with that report, Narelle, but every year there's a Surveillance Act report that's published by the federal government, and
it was in that.
Right, and and that covers all uses of the federal powers. It's the last one that came out was very interesting because it showed more than 300,000 uses of metadata. Enormous number of inquiries, and that it's that sort of a number that makes me wonder whether some of them were for sort of multiple sort of surveillance type things. There is actually a power in the Act for getting future access, which implies a sort of stream of data relating to a particular device or phone, and yet only 8 uses of the TOLA power. I mean, I think that it's a theme we haven't really been talking about yet, but the transparency issues are really challenging, because the way that the national security framework is set up, according to the Hope Commission, the agencies are set up independently of government. They're supposed to be apolitical, and there's a problem going on at the moment that they're all being brought under Home Affairs and seem to be politicized in a way which was contrary to their strategy for allowing these agencies to have the sort of power that they have. But they're supervised, by various inspectors and directorates and so on. And there's very little reporting on that, apart from possible in-camera sessions at Parliament and occasional Senate inquiries and leaks that come out about who's being prosecuted for being an agent that didn't act according to their brief. And so that happens, and then we have these limited facts being reported about the TOLA Act and about mandatory data retention in this annual surveillance report, which does give you some idea that the powers are being used for a particular prosecution, and there is a particular amount of success by law enforcement from using the powers that they've got, but it doesn't give you enough to know that they're being used effectively or properly or with moderation. And because the agencies can write their own notices, when there is a serious concern that that the process might be politicized. And so, we really do need to get a greater transparency and reporting, which enables people to have confidence that these powers are being used properly.
Yeah. So how do my members know if they're served with a warrant or a request, or just a request, that it is properly authorised? If there isn't this body of evidence about what a properly constituted one looks like, it starts to become, well, again, very difficult, and means the burden of regulation and compliance just grows and grows and grows. And our members largely are the smaller end of town. They do things on a shoestring. They do things quickly and rapidly, and to facilitate the networks and to facilitate their businesses.
Well, so, as Lucie was saying, we the problem with the Toller Act, one of the big problems with it is that now it's law. Who's got an incentive to challenge it? The incentive of the regulated entity is to try to minimise the cost of complying as quickly and effectively as possible, and that's all we've got, really.
Yeah. Actually, you mentioned that issues with data retention and so forth. I think you also mentioned in our discussions previously about the case of Sophie Spittles. Did you want to just take us through what happened there?
Well, I think recent developments, the Anom case, Project Ironside, or I think
Trojan Shield, they call
Trojan Shield in the US, the FBI.
Yeah.
The comments of the Prime Minister following that, saying that he called on Parliament to push through Identify and Disrupt and IPO, and some members weren't supporting it. But also, there's another act to do with security on work at ports and points of import where there is actually something being delayed for 3 years, and there's a political debate going on. But those two, Identify and Disrupt and IPO, they're held up due to government process, and particularly the IPO, they haven't done the executive agreement yet. So I don't know anybody's, that this is an example of political pressure sort of running with this idea that, that we shouldn't be paying attention to the detail and we should be pushing through legislation because it's law enforcement. But the Sophie Spittles case is interesting because, as I understand the facts, this young lady was subject to a domestic violence in her home, and she went to the police and reported it and voluntarily gave them her phone. They used some software to download everything that was on her phone, which wasn't really necessary and wasn't relevant, put it on a USB and accidentally gave it to the perpetrator as part of his brief of evidence.
Yeah.
So, it's a interesting case because it really, demonstrates just how casual ordinary police can be with the information they get and hold, and how easy it is to be careless with that information, and the need that we've been arguing for, that there be a proper framework around the information which is collected using these regulatory powers, so that we can have greater assurance that the information is only being used for the law enforcement purpose and isn't being carelessly shared otherwise.
Shared around. Yeah. And another thing that gets me about that is that we use her name there to talk about the case, and you referred to the perpetrator. Now, I don't know what the legal status is of that case, whether or not he has been convicted, or assuming it is he has been convicted of some act or action, whatever. It sounds like he did, or he was in the process of being. I don't know what the outcome was there, but why is it her name that's being used here and not his? But I should probably set that one aside. One of my staff has kindly given me the data here. Commonwealth Ombudsman, only 9 of nearly 2,000 accesses to location-based services by the Canberra policing were properly authorised. So 9 out of 2,000. And I think that did come from the report that you referred to on surveillance. I mean, those sorts of things are truly deeply troubling. And it just does seem that we get more and more legislation to enable more and more access with less and less oversight. None of it ever seems to be taken away. I don't know if there is a pathway to that, or how do we get to that? I just don't know, other than really to keep on doing what we're doing, and that is to look at it critically, to expose this for what it is. And to work constructively also with law enforcement to get the evildoers when we do need to do so. I'm just noting the time. At 6 o'clock, we did flag to people that we would move across to questions. And I do have one question here that I shall just bring up and pose to you all. Okay, the question is, assuming the access to industry networks scope creep continues down the same path, what are your thoughts on the use of customer-specific warrant canaries or other mechanisms in order to provide individuals or companies a measure of confidence that A, they aren't subject to surveillance, or B, as was pointed out by Lucie, they aren't subject to the effects of surveillance, given that could mean performance issues on their services? Furthermore, what are your thoughts on the legal implications for a provider who chooses to implement and attempt to provide those types of non-notifications? Wow, that's a concept. Do I need to repeat any of that for you all? How do I help my members?
Well, I can say that the Toller Act says it's an offence to say that you are or are not subject to an order. So there's just no way. You can't put a canary note up saying, you know, we've had no orders and then take it down. The statement that you've had no orders is an offence under the Act. That's the first thing. The second thing is, look, it's a real dilemma. I think, you know, the police and the national security agencies don't want to maintain secrecy regarding their techniques and regarding who they're watching and when, so they can catch the offenders. And so you can't be publishing a note about this stuff. But I think there are a couple of really interesting questions arising from Trojan Shield, right? The first one is, well, if they'd undermined encryption so that nobody trusted it, the whole scam wouldn't have worked. So there's one for encryption, right? They bought that the devices they were using were secure because there wasn't some procedure where, you know, all algorithms or all key, you know, everything had a key. But the second thing to say about it is, I can't understand exactly why the Australian police have claimed that they used the Toller Act for it, because the devices apparently were made by the FBI and were distributed with an information sharing facility in it. So if they were actually getting access to content, surely they would have had warrants. Or is this an example of the Toller Act being used to create access to messages so you don't need a warrant? They're shared with you automatically. Or was there access to data held by some third party, you know, perhaps on the servers that were hosting the system or accessing the messages, which required a Toller power to be used to get access to their data?
Oh, so, you think they used a commercial third-party data services farm?
Yeah, I'd just like to understand that, so that when we get this push from the Prime Minister telling us, you know, we need more laws like this, and, you know, that Toller was used and so on, we could actually understand why it was useful.
Yeah, how and in what way? Yeah, absolutely. We would love to know exactly how and in what way, so that we can understand it and effectively comply with it when required to do so, especially if they're going to get some pretty nasty pieces of scum. You know, I've got no problems with them catching people who've actually done wrong things. Or are in the process.
I just make that point that it's not apparent from the way that it worked and how they did it that they needed the Act at all.
No, because they gave them the apps, or they sold them the apps. The irony, the sweet, delicious irony there of the alleged criminals paying the FBI for the pleasure of using the app. It's just, it's quite entertainment. So if I could call upon members, people who are present, attendees, if you've got any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat, so that I can post them here to our eminent panel. It's just a wonderful panel we have here. Konstantinos, Patrick, Lucie, it really has been great having you. So please, folks, if you've got questions, please fire them in, and we'll keep on chatting while we have that.
Can I just say something very quickly about this idea of exploiting vulnerabilities, right? Whether for law enforcement purposes, security testing, or any other purpose, you know, we should not take them lightly. And because from a technical perspective, right, the hacking and information communications resource without consent of the owner or the user is always an attack, regardless of its motivation. And we need to be very conscious of that. And at the same time, we should be fully aware that exploits can be stolen, leaked, and replicated, and they create massive security gaps within the network that might create, spillover effects.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
these are things that we need to be very conscious about, because just because you're creating vulnerability here, it will spill over and will create this
Absolutely
insecure network for everyone else that is using it, and they're not even aware that they're using an insecure network. And it goes back to the whole transparency idea. So we need to be very mindful of what we're doing, and we keep on repeating this idea of proportionality, and perhaps there is something there, but we need to insist that we really need to weigh off what it is that we're sacrificing and that what it is that we're saving in order to be able and make those decisions. And Patrick is a lawyer, and he will know more about
no, you're absolutely correct. A backdoor is a backdoor is a backdoor. It's got, unless you've got really good security on the back door, then anybody gets in and bank accounts go. I mean, if we look at the way that scammers are effective at taking people's money, that give them some extra backdoors, they will use them. No question whatsoever. And it is encryption that is the fundamental part of how our whole financial system works. Our economies stay up because of encryption. Actually, we do have I have to admit, it's a tongue-in-cheek question here about the Anom app. From a consumer law perspective, was it deceptive and misleading? Do the folks here who've been do they have some comeback? I mean, normally under the Australian consumer law, I think all you get is your money back, or you get a replacement product or a repair. So maybe they'll issue you with a new version of a NOM that doesn't have the FBI listening. I don't know.
Yeah, the crim that sold it to the other crim for what, $1,700 can sue for his money back.
It needs to give them their money back at least. Yeah, I'm not quite sure if that's going to happen somehow.
So I don't have the consumer law perspective on this, but I do think that's an interesting thought exercise, because with a lot of these measures, like the proportionality, the financial proportionality, I often question. Like when I look at the amount of money, as Konstantinos said, like we are building such expensive infrastructure, and then it's used a handful of times. Is like, what is the actual cost per use on some of this legislation? Is my question from a purely someone who pays taxes in Australia perspective. I worry. But second, is it proportionate? The FBI and AFP basically provided a secure communications channel for 12,000 plus users for over 3 years to conduct crime. So where do we sit in terms of time lapsed on an operation like that? How many people died during that time? How many people's children died of overdoses during that time? What is the consideration that was put into this? And to me, those are some of like the bigger, right now there's this kind of bravado and people are in handcuffs, and I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed by that. But law enforcement made a decision for 3 years to watch that criminal activity unfold. And I think we should be really concerned about that. And I think what Patrick actually said about how Tola was used, I'm really trying to review and keep up with the documentation as it's coming out, the court documents that are coming out. It seems to be a combination of things, because the FBI, from their court filings, didn't have the authority to intercept a lot of the communications that were coming through. So that's where AFP came in. And so the BCC sort of basically, that BCC that went to the third server, that sort of ghost, it's almost that ghost user proposal that GCHQ put forward a few years ago, right? That entire idea that you can have an encrypted communication and someone can be inserted into that communication without the mathematics being triggered and saying there's somebody new in this conversation, which is what the encrypted apps do now. If you add somebody new in a Signal conversation or WhatsApp conversation, they let you know that the keys have changed. And the proposal then from GCHQ was, what if you guys took away that? And obviously the risk of that is huge, because then you can have any sort of third party enter your private conversations. It could be adversaries and spies from other countries. You're really introducing, so we have these robust infrastructure laws now to protect from malicious state attacks, essentially, right? That's the entire conversation at the big international forums. Konstantinos might be able to chime in on that, but that's what we're worried about. But somehow we're like, okay, sacrificing this infrastructure to those sorts of attacks, not to mention identity theft and actual bank fraud and everything else that comes with it. So that, to me, I agree with Patrick. I think those are the two places where I think TOLA was used.
It's interesting too that apparently the reports say that the way that they tag the messages with a key which effectively BCC'd them to a third-party server in another country. So the other interesting dimension to this is, what was the importance of the international connection? Why did they want to get those messages outside the US and outside Australia, or was the other country Australia? And if so, why? You know, the whole thing is very curious, because, you know, it's an offence under Australian telecommunications law to interfere with the delivery of a message. So you need to have lawful authority for that.
Yeah, indeed, you do need to have lawful authority for that. Now, you both mentioned the Richardson report. I thought one of the pluses of the Richardson report was that actually we would review the long list of places where these sorts of things are, well, where interception is authorised. That's certainly a challenge that I see, that I have and that my members have, that how do they know which piece of legislation applies at which particular time when it just comes to interception? You know, that is one particularly difficult area. So how, you know, it would be really nice if all of those things were consolidated down into one nice, neat piece of legislation, and that was the only one I had to deal with.
Well, the benefit that occurs to me, Narelle, is that, you know, think about the mandatory data retention regime and how there's the journalist information warrant framework there. Now, it's a pretty dodgy framework, frankly. You know, there's so many ways that you could get around it to get information about a journalist, to find out the source of some story that you were, you know, not happy with. But there's no similar framework in relation to TOLA, and the kind of powers in TOLA, it could be used in exactly the same way to undermine the journalism. So the possibility of consolidating the regime into a single framework certainly invites the community to say, well, wait a second, now we'd like to see some transparency that we can really understand. Like, who's responsible for the supervision? What information are we getting? Is that information consistent across the different warrants and subpoenas and requests for information? Are we getting sort of effectiveness reporting and intrusion, sort of, you know, some sort of evaluation of, you know, the quid pro quo? And are we confident that we're protecting journalists who are, you know, able to find out, you know, so they are able to find out and report? There was a, you know, a fabulous paper prepared under the guidance of Peter Grester's organisation in Australia, where he produced a protection of journalism piece of legislation, you know, as a draft, and said, look, here are the protections we should put in place to ensure freedom of the press in Australia. I'm surprised that, you know, the paper hasn't gone anywhere, because it was very well considered, and the sort of powers that were there with broad application could have a major impact on the strength of the press in Australia.
Yeah, it certainly does sound like an interesting piece. And Peter Grester, yes, his own experience is one that really, I think, illustrates the whole, the many issues there with journalists, and the needing to keep journalists able to act and work effectively. I'm also reminded too by a phrase that Konstantinos used earlier, which was the internet's going to suffer from death by 1,000 cuts. And we've seen recently too the defamation law used across by a number of locations on maybe arguably what people might think would be fairly trivial commentary from fairly unknown people, but where they've directed it towards a politician, and that politician has then come out and sued for defamation. Konstantinos, if you're not aware, well, I live, and Patrick here, I think, lives in the defamation capital of the world. And people are being sued now for throwaway remarks on Twitter or Facebook or social media, sued by politicians. And this seems to be, you know, a big stick for not much gain. Are there any other thoughts along those lines, or is this what was her name, the singer and her house that was photographed? Sorry, I can't think of the name of the expression. What is it? You know the one I mean? No, Barbara Streisand, thank you.
Oh,
Somebody's
oh.
reminded me, the Streisand effect. You know, the
Oh,
Streisand
yes.
effect where Barbara's house was pictured and then she sued them. And of course, nobody cared that her picture of her house was up there until she sued. And of course, now we have the case of the politicians suing people for making, casting aspersions. Is that a big deal or not? I mean, that's a fairly minor piece of legislation, I would have thought, but it could be quite an impact on somebody who doesn't have any money.
I think it's a huge deal. And I hope that Peter Dutton's sitting somewhere like incredibly embarrassed by how that went down.
Oh, that was another case, wasn't it?
Because if you hold political office or you're in any sort of position of power and you think it's appropriate to take legislative action against people who are like just kind of going about their business, whether they're your constituents or just individuals or citizens, whatever term we want to give the people in this. If you think that's an appropriate use of your time or your money or your office, I truly hope they're ashamed of themselves by the way that they're treating the internet right now. And the death by 1,000 cuts is a really good analog. And we're just seeing a really, and I've seen it over the past few years, like working in Europe as well, we see a real fragmentation of the free and open web, because with the freedom to share information also comes a lot of feedback and comes a lot of pushback. And governments in particular don't like the ability of the internet to bring a global audience. They don't like that people have opinions that disagree with them. I think in the past, a lot of the times, either politicians, either you had a website that the government communicated in a sort of one directional way. So suddenly you're flooded with a 24-hour, 7 days a week feedback loop. And I don't think they're equipped. They mentally, they obviously don't have the resilience or thick skin to deal with that. But it's par for the course. Like I have, women face this every day. We have arguments with really weird people calling us all sorts of and insulting us in a million different ways. And I have never thought to myself, the person who called for me to be raped should, I'm going to sue them for something. It's that is the nature of the openness of the communications channels that we have on the internet. And I think that's wonderful. And in my work, I've seen it work for good, but I see it being unpicked, whether that's through data localization laws, or everything else. That's just bit by bit. I think we're seeing it disintegrate. The new e-safety proposal, I think actually is going to, in a big way, impact the way this, especially the adult cyberbullying scheme, which I just suggested should be scrapped. I think that's absurd. But I think it's really going to just change the way we're able to interact with each other, and to our detriment.
Well, that legislation is not yet passed.
Sorry.
But the code creation process has started. Because what is being expected is that industry will have to set up a whole bunch of codes or one code or 10 codes. I don't know how many codes, and I don't quite know how they're going. Well, we don't yet know how they will apply or how they will work in order to comply with this. And if we don't set up effective codes, then we'll have a standard imposed upon us is likely to be the outcome, which means then there'll be big fines and big sticks if we don't take stuff down in 24 hours. I mean, 24 hours is a really short period of time. Sorry, Konstantinos, I can see you about to burst there. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, going back to the original discussion about the defamation. Again, this is a global trend. We are literally seeing Brazil is doing it, Mexico, India, where the government is trying to essentially tell platforms that they should not be allowed to speak against the government. And they're trying to pass legislation to that effect, using the internet in a way that, to control those communications and control the way those communications circulate. I mean, in India, a very clear example happened during the farmers' protest, where Rihanna, of all people, literally just sent out a tweet saying, aren't we talking about what is happening right now in India? And the Indian government literally went down to Twitter and said, you need to take it down. And, on top of that, the other trend is that we are seeing now governments actually obliging tech companies to open offices in the countries so that they're able to go and arrest people that they don't comply with whatever request they come down. So we are literally talking about the weaponization in many ways of the internet, right? And we have always been talking about it, but this time it just feels different because we actually see the effects. And Lucie is right. The openness of the internet is really in jeopardy. We are seeing in the name of national security or in the name of government or whatever, we are seeing data localization laws going stronger and stronger. And I would like to repeat the comment that I've made in my opening remarks, that this is not any longer reserved to jurisdictions that we were used to seeing it, like, you know, Russia, for instance, or China. This is coming now from democratic jurisdictions.
Yeah.
The European Union is wanted to pass a very strict data localization act that was essentially forbidding even commercial data from leaving Europe. So we are talking about a complete overhaul and inward looking, and this is where the tension is happening, because the internet is all about outwards looking and connecting people, and governments increasingly want to see less and less of that happening. And we are now at a risk where we are going to have a global communications network in theory, but in practice, those networks will not be able to interoperate.
Okay, well, you did mention the opening remarks. I suppose, and given the time, I should probably do a round robin again to get some closing remarks. Unfortunately, we don't have any coming from New Zealand because, unfortunately, with illness in InternetNZ, we had to have Jordan step in this evening, and unfortunately, we didn't quite have the time to do it full justice. But let's go back over then some of the themes from this evening, and who should I pick on first? I just don't know. Shall I just go, quick, you, one of you, jump out? And I mean, some of these things that we've brought up here, yes, yeah, I don't know where to start or stop here. So perhaps I will jump to Patrick then, because you got the last word first time, so maybe you get the first word this time. Patrick.
Well, it's hard to know, what to pick out of. I think we've covered a lot of really important issues. To my mind, I think that the tree of liberty is, constantly fed by the blood of patriots, and so you can't imagine we're going to get to a stable state where all these things are satisfactory, or get too depressed and disheartened by the little battles that we lose. I think the important thing is to keep plugging away at the powers that the government is asking for to deal with, fighting crime and ensuring national security in an internet environment. And to a large extent, the powers and the sort of the transition we need to make so there are powers to deal with the electronic environment, I think is reasonable. And if I was in their position trying to cope with the advanced criminal gangs and so on, I would be looking for similar powers. But that said, we need to make sure that they're considerate of the rights of the citizens, that they're there's proper judicial authority behind the issue of the warrants, and there's real transparency that people can understand and access regarding the exercise of these powers. And those things are just missing. Worst of all is the protection of journalists and a free press from the ways these powers are executed. I was giving evidence to the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security a few months ago. One of the senators sort of said to me, "But are you saying our people, our national security, are going to do the wrong thing? That they'll be misusing these powers?" And I said, "No, I'm saying that you're writing bad law." I've got no basis for thinking that the people who are there to protect me and are spending my taxes doing so are acting in bad faith. I just like to see our laws written properly so that there's a decent framework which gives us confidence that we can't go down the path of a Duterte or a nation state. There are so many examples of liberal democracies going into fascism or into periods of terror because of a failure to maintain proper systems and supervision of their police and security infrastructure.
Yeah, well, that's not a very cheery note there. Patrick, you started out quite optimistic there that we should keep chipping away, keep working at it. But yeah, you're right. It is a question of making sure that we do have well-founded laws with the appropriate balances in there. And I might also caution that, yes, I agree with you that the people who are working to catch the evildoers are often, I believe, genuinely acting in good faith. And I have confidence in the vast majority of them. But I also have confidence in the fact that they are human too. And they are also subject to the foibles and failures that humans are. So, okay, perhaps I should then go to Lucie for your closing thoughts there, Lucie.
Oh, I have so many thoughts about that specifically. I think there's often this tendency to say it wouldn't happen, but the problem is you didn't plan for it happening. And I think the worst scenario that we saw was 2016 when Trump was elected in office in the US. And suddenly there was a really hardline administration on a lot of issues. And it sort of exposed a lot of legislation that was really loosely written. And so I think like if this government is writing it, if you had a really worst case government, or you had like an extremely racist or discriminatory government or an extremely religious government elected, would the law be able be open to abuse? And the reality is, as Patrick pointed out, the law is just really poorly drafted in that regard. I think the fact that we're not giving people rights and mechanisms across all these legislations that we've discussed today is tragic and fixable. But it's to me, it's hard because the e-safety proposal, in the same way, relies on Julie's and the office's ability to do that responsibly and do that, in line with Australian values, whatever that may be. And I think a lot of people already would feel very oppressed by the notion of Australian values being the used northern star of this. But she's a fantastic representative because this is, she's been on the pony tour with this proposal, and she looks like an incredibly trustworthy person to give that power to. But I think, who will replace her, and who will replace that person after them? And do you trust them with something that's that broadly worded? So to me, those are incredible concerns for individuals' rights. And I really grapple with that in Australia, because at least in Europe and in the US and in Canada, all the places I lived, you have a civil society that's able to litigate, and you have people being able to express their rights. And those are often clunky mechanisms, but even the Investigatory Powers Act in the UK has been under litigation at both the European Court of Human Rights and the CJEU, so the Court of Justice of the European Union. It's been litigated wherever they could have. Obviously, CJEU now no longer has jurisdiction over UK, but here I think we don't have those mechanisms, and it's really Australia is really what we saw in Ironside, where Australia is potentially being used as a loophole in other legal systems. I'm concerned that's going to become increasingly the role of Australia. And quite frankly, the glib sort of smiles that they have on their faces as they use this operation now to bully Parliament to pass increasingly invasive legislation. That's what it is. It's bullying. You're using the photos of people in handcuffs and terrifying screenshots, and you're using the emotional connection that people have to losing loved ones to drugs to bully Parliament to pass legislation that they've been trying to deliberate and actually pass with some sort of legality and human rights at the core. So I'm scared, but I'm encouraged because places like RightsCon give me that love in my heart. Konstantinos is smiling. I'm gonna wrap, but when I think of Maria Ressa and everything that she went through, and all these people who come to places like RightsCon, that's what I think when I think resilience. And they're able to smile, and we're there as an international community standing up to it. So I'm not losing hope. We're going to keep fighting it, but it's just absurd the way this government has taken, I think, liberties with what's acceptable on the internet.
There's a couple of things I do need to mention that you raised there. With respect to the e-safety commissioner, we did actually invite the e-safety commissioner and her office to attend this evening, but we have not been able to get her or a representative on our onto one of our events, and we will continue to work with them in order to do so, because we're very keen to work constructively with the E-Safety Commissioner and any other regulator that we have either here in Australia or elsewhere. I'm very keen to have them assist our members and the community at large. Actually, another thing I wanted to mention too was that I had a contact today from a member of the meeting planning committee for an international standards body, say that their community have said that the Australian legislation is so punitive that they don't think that they can ever comply with their operating principles, so they will never have this. They may never have this conference here in Australia. So so that means we may not see the Internet Engineering Task Force come to Australia to work on internet standards. The community is going to discuss this and debate this, so we may yet see them, but we'll wait and see. I'd be curious to hear what people think about that, but unfortunately we'll run out of time tonight. Konstantinos, over to you, and then perhaps we'll end up being able to go to social time.
Thanks, Narelle. I guess the only thing that I want to say, and I'm going to hang up from something that Lucie said, you know, we keep on hearing about regulation according to Australian values, European values, American values, and no one is really talking about the internet's values, right? And for the organization that I am working for, one of the things that we are really very hard try to do is put to the forefront those values, and I put values in quotes because people use different words to describe them. We say these are the properties of the internet that make the internet really the internet with capital I, right? This idea of a decentralized network that is interoperable, that is global, open, based on building blocks. So in moving forward, because regulation is not going to go anywhere, and in some cases it shouldn't, we are faced with the reality that we at the Internet Society have been calling for an internet impact assessment analysis as part of regulatory process. And we're saying, you know, we are at we don't want to reach at a stage where the environmental regulation reached, where things were somewhat irreversible, and suddenly everybody woke up to the realization, oh my God, we need to protect the environment. We are at this stage when it comes to the internet. We need to protect the internet, because unless we have you know, an open and interoperable internet, we won't be able to exercise human rights, we won't be able to do business, we won't be able to do innovation, and all those things that have ensured over the past 20 years and have given a completely different flavor to the world. So a way forward perhaps would be to do that, because an impact assessment would be able to identify those gaps. It will be able to identify what the problems are with regulation and call out those people that are using excuses of national security or what have you in order to be able to do this right. And I will stop here.
That is a great concept, Konstantinos. I think I've heard you mention that before, the internet impact analysis or impact assessment analysis. Exactly. The concept there, I think, is a really sound one. So perhaps we will have to unpack that one a bit more at a later date, or work out some standard wording for our universal submissions that are going to come out from every single little piece of legislation from now on in. I need to do a draw for the Lucky Door Prize, because I think we're actually at the end now. First of all, I have to thank Jordan in absentia. Jordan, thank you. It was marvellous having your inputs, and we could have had some more of them. Lucie, a huge thank you to you for taking the time out. I know it's you've spent a lot of time online this week, and having some more time with your thoughts this evening has just been fantastic. Patrick, also your expertise has been fantastic, and really appreciate you having contributed it to us. Konstantinos, of course, you're about to head off into a bright summer's day. I am eternally jealous at the moment. Those pictures of Greece you keep sending me really are doing my head in. But either way, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a most illuminating discussion. I really do appreciate it, and I hope our members and guests from both Australia and around the world have appreciated it. I've just